Okay, guys, welcome to my competitive tier list. So there are a lot of people that have been creating a lot of tier lists as far as hunters to pick, as far as rank goes. But the way this tier list is going to work is I'm going to be ranking the hunters based on how I see them fit on the competitive scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start. I have 5 different ranks. The S tier are the meta hunters right now. A tier are the strong hunters to be used in later rounds. B tier is for situational hunters. Sometimes these hunters are also surprise picks, but these are some solid picks for the later rounds. Not quite as strong as A tier. But then we have C tier, which are hunters to pick purely as surprise picks, or if there is a specific comp that you're looking to counter, you might be able to use one of these hunters. And then D tier, I only have 3 hunters down here, but these are the hunters that I deem are not tournament viable. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the D tier survivors, starting with Hell Ember. Now, the reason why Ember does not function very well on the competitive scene is because, of course, as we all know, Ember has a very weak early game. Pretty much no matter how the Ember plays, the Ember is going to struggle in finding a down before the first 3 ciphers are popped. Now, Ember does have one of the best, if not the best, camping in the game. But at the end of the day, in this meta, a lot of times that leads to losing setups if at best you're going to be getting a down before the first 3 pops. Because if you are not getting a down before the first 3 pops are up, then you're not going to be able to function very well to recover a match, because then the survivors will just not rescue, and at best you're going to be getting a tie out of a situation like that, if not completely losing. So next on the tier list, I have Nightmare here. Now, Nightmare actually does have a pretty decent max presence, but the issue with Nightmare, same as Ember, although not quite as extreme, Nightmare very much struggles with the early game. So, yeah, his early game chase is just not it. He's able to get tight kited and transitional kited. Both forms of kiting work very well against this hunter, and especially with the types of survivors that are being picked very much at the competitive level. Nightmare is just too weak to compensate by the time he gets to his max presence. The next hunter I would put down here is a Photographer. Now, Photographer, it sits really funny in this competitive type of tier list, because I put him very low in this tier list because against players with 4 VC, that's where his ability gets completely countered. But if you're going to be playing Photo in ranked, Photo actually works very well in ranked, because the survivors will not have for survivor communication. But if survivors are able to communicate where the hunter's at and find secluded places to heal up, there's just too much luck that has to be involved for the Photographer to actually get anything, especially on large maps, because Photographer in competitive doesn't function very well with the option of spawn selections. So if you're against a Photo, you're able to place all your survivors very far away from each other. So at most, the hunter is going to be able to see 2 survivors in the camera world by the time that the camera world falls. In addition to this, all of his jump scares that he's known for just don't work on the competitive level. So that's why I put the D tier hunters where I did. Now, in C tier, these are hunters that you can use, but they are extremely situational. A lot of times you're only going to be picking them if you're going to be either surprising the survivors, or if there is a particular comp reason why you would want to pick one of these hunters. In the bottom of this list, I put Ripper. Ripper is one of the hunters that I believe is actually very strong in like mid-tier hunter ranked, because he is one of the hunters that goes all in on the early game chase. If you're able to get a Foggy Blade and a fast down, that's the only way that Ripper is able to win. However, with the competitive survivors and survivors that are really great at transitional kiting, think your Patient, your Toy Merchant, your Priestess, all of these survivors are going to be very good against Ripper and the Fire Rescuer. is going to be very, very good against Ripper, because in order to get rid of his ability, he's going to have to waste a Foggy Blade. Just at the competitive level, he's not going to be able to fight for very much unless you're going up against inexperienced survivors. Up next, we have Percy. Percy is one of those hunters that it's kind of interesting that he would fit down here on the tier list, because he has arguably some of the strongest chase in the game. He has very, very strong chase for transitional kiting. In addition to that, at 50 energy, he becomes immune to stuns, so his chase is actually very, very scary. But of course, as we all know, Percy cannot actually use rocket chairs, and survivors are able to have a lot more counterplay against when they have to heal up survivors than when the hunter is able to put them on a rocket chair. There's just so much more that the survivors are able to do with it. So even though Percy has a very, very strong chase, in a game like IDV, he just does not function properly. Up next, we have Feaster. Feaster is one of those characters that actually used to be, like, 10 seasons ago, actually used to be a pretty solid pick. He would be kind of a decent pick for like the later rounds if you were very, very specialized with Feaster. But the problem is now, especially with all the transitional kiters that we have and survivors that are able to tank multiple hits, Feaster just does not have the early game to compensate. He does have a very, very strong late game camp, so if he's able to build up the presence with a really good early game, that's where Feaster is able to snowball. But in combination of the early game chase being kind of mid, in addition to just requiring that presence, in addition to that, he does not have like any mobility or map control, which is something that is very, very important at the competitive level. As you'll see in the tiers above, hunters that do well in competition are ones that are either very, very mobile or can exert lots of map pressure. Up next, we have Violinist. Violinist was a hunter that was very, very strong upon release, but over time, survivors have learned to adapt to his style of gameplay, in addition to a series of nerfs that brought him down to where he is. Violinist can be somewhat decent to fight for a draw, but his early game can sometimes be really tough to manage. In addition to that, he does not gain too much to his ability once he starts building up presence. So Violinist needs a very, very strong early game, but with his max presence being something that a lot of times doesn't even get used very often in the match, Violinist is something that I would not expect to see come out very often in tournament. So that's why I put Violinist where he is. Up next, we have Wuchang. He's one of those hunters that can come out as a surprise pick. In fact, we did see this when HHDG was facing GR in KOA 7. During a third round, Wuchang ended up coming out because I think the hunter needed to get a 4-survivor elimination. Now, the reason why Wuchang doesn't do very well here is because in competitive, survivors are able to know what hunter they're facing, and which makes the first umbrella a lot less effective. In addition to this, his early game chase is very, very difficult, which means that he's going to have to carry Insolence and Blink, which is something that if you have to carry both of those, it leads to a very, very draw mentality, and it's kind of known in competition when you go left down Blink. That's, at least in the season we're in, that's a way to fight for a tie. But Wuchang, if he's used to fight for a win, because once he builds up the presence, he has very, very strong abilities, but without the presence, he's just not super scary. So that's why I put the survivors that I put in C tier where they're at. Up next, we have the B tier hunters, which are situational hunters or surprise picks. So a lot of these hunters will be used if you're looking to counter a certain comp. They're also very, very specialized hunters. So if you play these hunters, a lot of times they'll be like a specific comfort hunter for a given hunter, and will be used most often in rounds 2 or 3, with some exceptions in here. But at the bottom of this tier, I decided to put Sculptor. Sculptor is one of my favorite hunters to play in competitive. Sculptor used to be meta. There was a good chunk of time when Sculptor was meta, but upon release, there were a series of nerfs to Sculptor Spike, and then eventually the kind of nail in the coffin to kind of secure out of the S tier meta was actually the nerf that they did to the max presence statues, which made it so that when two statues combine, they stay put for a short amount of time before releasing. This made them significantly more reactable and greatly decrease Sculptor's ability to snowball a match. Now, the reason why Sculptor is still strong is that she does still have that spike, which gives her a little bit of map pressure. In addition to this, she has a somewhat decent early game chase, and if you're able to get a really solid early game, you can actually, in combination with the map pressure, can lead to some really, really strong games. She does require max presence to be at like full power there. Once she gets full presence, she's very, very strong. Not quite as strong as she was before she got severely nerfed, but her max presence is still very good, which is why a lot of sculptors will run Insolence. So left down blink is a common build. Up down teleport is another common build. I like to use this on large maps. And also the traditional detention trump card blink is also a viable pick for this hunter, although sometimes a little bit more difficult to play. Up next we have Axeboy. Axeboy is one of those hunters that doesn't come out in competitive too frequently, but he is still a hunter that I think can be used very effectively in competitive if you know how to play him very, very well. Now, Axeboy used to be, like, upon release, one of the worst characters in the game. Like, he would be D tier just because you could rotate away from the trees and you had nothing to do. You would have no way to actually catch up to the survivors if they rotate properly. But now Axeboy has the purple souls that follow the survivors and actually can lead to some really scary early game situations. His early game chase can be very, very good, and in competitive can be used a lot of times to fight for a tie. Perhaps not quite as effectively as some of the hunters that are in A tier, but Axeboy is still a solid character pick given the situation. Up next we have Evil Reptilian. Now, Reptilian is one of those hunters that used to be quite bad, but recently got a really nice buff, which made his max presence so that he would be able to get unlimited jumps. The one downside to Lizard is that sometimes the early game can be really rough, but there are some situations where Reptilian can be used in competitive to get a slight edge, particularly during a round 3 situation. Can have a decent early game along with the max presence, although there are many situations where the early game is going to be a little bit tough to get that first down, particularly if the comp has a lot of stunners, which is what Reptilian is a little bit weak to get against, but still a solid character pick. In addition to those limited jumps, they also function very well to help Lizard have some semblance of map control and mobility. Now, Mad Eyes is a very, very interesting hunter to put in here. Mad Eyes is a hunter that is very, very strong in the right hands, but is also one of the most difficult hunters to play in the game. Now, Mad Eyes is one of the trappiest hunters in this game. There are a lot of traps that you can set up with the walls. Being a former Espage Mad Eyes myself, it's very important to know all of your setups that you can do. The thing about Mad Eyes is that he's very, very map dependent. That's the first thing. And the early game can sometimes be very rough. In addition to this, at the competitive level, Mad Eyes can be counter-comped. Now, the one thing about this is that the comps that Mad Eyes are weak against, there are a lot of other hunters in the meta that are very, very strong against those kinds of counter-comps. So Mad Eyes can be a very useful hunter to bait out certain comps in competitive, but Mad Eyes, a lot of times, as we saw RD Dream this Koa struggling a little bit against some of the survivor comps. If the survivors are adequately prepared, Mad Eyes can be very, very tough to play in competitive. But again, Mad Eyes is one of those more rare hunters that you're more likely going to go against survivors that will not have adequate prep to go against this hunter, which is what makes him very, very strong. In addition to this, if you're able to get one of the early game traps by a mistake of the survivors, it can lead to some very, very scary situations, especially if Mad Eyes gets one of the chairs that he's able to uh, camp out very, very well. Now up next, this might be a slightly controversial pick, but I would put Fool's Gold in B tier here. I do believe that Fool's Gold can be a solid pick, especially on maps like the first one that comes to mind is Eversleeping. Moonlit is also a solid one. Basically, large maps that are very, very open are maps that are strong for Fool's Gold. Now, the reason why this is because during the early game, he's able to throw his pickaxe and dash to it, which allows him to start a chase very, very early. So his early game chase is quite solid. In addition to the rock, he does have some semblance of map pressure if he's able to get it down, but sometimes the early game chase can be stalled out quite a long time, especially if survivors are playing very strong transitional characters. I'm talking about like your forward, your cowboy, your mercenary, your patient, acrobat. These are all kind of characters that tend to be somewhat strong against Fool's Gold, but he does have a very decent camp, and in the late game does have quite a decent amount of mobility, which I believe puts Fool's Gold solidly in B tier. Now up next on this list, I put Spider. Spider is one that we actually saw in the final matchup of Koa 7. It was used to get a draw when possible. Spider was one of those hunters that is very, very strong when you need a tie. In addition to this, she's able to, if she builds up her webs, can get some pretty fast downs. But the thing that makes Spider somewhat rough, at least as she currently stands in the meta, I know that she's going to be getting buffed soon, and we'll have to see how Spider stands after that. But the way Spider stands, she can be very, very effective to get ties, especially on maps like Lakeside and Chinatown are two of the particular ones that stand out to me the most. Up next on the tier list, I have a Breaking Wheel here. Now, Breaking Wheel is one of those characters, I'm going to call them very risky but winning picks. And there are a few hunters on this tier list that are like that. The first one that comes to mind is Breaking Wheel. Now, the reason why Breaking Wheel is not higher on this list is because of a variety of factors, but one of them being the prevalence of Flywheel. Flywheel is very, very good against his ability because survivors will be able to flywheel through traps. In addition to this, survivors can actually flywheel the snap if they time it properly, which makes playing Breaking Wheel at the competitive level something that's a bit riskier. Now, if Wheel is able to get a very nice early game, this can actually lead to some snowbally situations that we saw a lot when Wheel was up at the top of the meta. But nowadays, Breaking Wheel can struggle sometimes. In addition to this, Wheel is very, very map dependent. I really only see Wheel used on Chinatown, Eversleeping, and occasionally Moonlit, but Chinatown and Eversleeping are the two most prevalent ones for this hunter. Up next, kind of in the same boat as Breaking Wheel, we have Hermit. Hermit is one of those hunters that can get away with having a bit of a slower early game, but he does require a lot of precision with what ciphers you decide to conjoin together. In addition to this, Hermit does sometimes struggle in the early game, but if he's able to get it down eventually, he's able to snowball quite quickly from there after he gets his first down. But there are a lot of situations where Hermit goes through the majority of the match struggling to get through the early game chase, and if the Hermit struggles to get that first down, that's where the survivors can end up in some really solid situations. So Hermit is one of those 4-man or no-man type hunters, generally speaking, in competitive, but can fight for a win a lot of the time. He's a very, very strong hunter. Very, very strong and competitive. So that's why I put the B tier hunters where they're at. And now up to A tier. These are going to be your main picks for later rounds in competitive. And at the bottom of A tier, I put Bonbon. Bonbon was one of those characters... Bonbon and Bloody Queen both were both characters that I didn't know whether I wanted to put them at A tier or B tier. Bonbon is one of those hunters that is going to be one of the main tie comps. Uh, so Bonbon, especially if you go like Insolence, Detention, Blink, Bon can sometimes struggle a little bit in the early game if there are a lot of transitional characters, but if he's able to get it down, it's almost impossible competitively to get a rescue against a Bonbon, which is why he's very, very strong to fight for that tie. Now, if Bonbon does get a stuff on the camp, or if Bonbon gets two very, very fast downs, those are the ways that Bonbon can win. However, at the competitive level, more often than not, if we see a Bon come out, he's going to be fighting for a tie. And up next, we have Bloody Queen, which is in a very similar boat, but for different reasons. Bloody Queen, just the way that her math works out with her mirrors, can able to get, if she's very accurate with her mirrors, can reliably get it down in her first two mirrors. But the reason why she sometimes struggles to fight for a win is that her ability is single use and has quite a hefty cooldown. Sometimes if she's able to get kind of an early game advantage, sometimes it can be tough to kind of snowball it into more, especially if survivors are able to communicate and kind of leave her without a chase for a little while, especially after the first elimination. Sometimes survivors get the opportunity to re-heal, but she's usually able to get one down before the pop, and if she gets that elimination, a lot of times she'll be able to get one down with Detention, and that's how most Bloody Queen matches go. She really struggles after the first down to actually turn something into a winning advantage as long as the survivors communicate properly. But she's very, very strong in tournament as long as you're looking to fight for a tie. Up next we have Geisha. Geisha is another one of those hunters that tends to fight for a tie, but has maybe slightly more winning odds than Bloody Queen, which is why I put Geisha slightly higher than Bloody Queen on this tier list. Geisha has quite a strong early game, actually. Sometimes at the competitive level, it can be difficult to fight with the mechanics of Geisha, as she has to be very, very precise with her butterflies in order to get the dashes off properly. In addition to this, she does have some counter comps that are somewhat more difficult to go against, but in a meta of transitional kiters that we're seeing now, Geisha actually is very, very strong against transitional kiting, which is why I put her in A tier on this list. Up next, we have Clerk. Clerk I put slightly above Geisha here because Clerk is a very, very strong hunter. She's able to fight for a win in competitive. The main struggle that Clerk has is going for that early game chase, but if she's able to get that early game down, she's able to snowball like almost no other hunter on this tier list. Just the fact that she's able to record survivors and perpetually keep them off ciphers, becomes a real struggle with the final pop. In addition to this, it's very, very difficult to actually get an exit gate open against her. Because she's able to almost permanently lock them down whenever they get, whenever Clerk looks at a gate and records a survivor. It can be very, very difficult to actually open an exit gate, even if you have 3 survivors up during the pop, because she's able to keep a survivor occupied at the gate at the same time that she's able to chase with Detention to get another down. So Clerk is one of those hunters that also, even though she's able to fight for those wins in the late game, if she has a struggle in the early game, if there are 4 survivors up by the pop, a lot of times survivors can actually get the win against her. So not quite S tier, but she is a very, very solid pick. Up next, I decided to put Wax Artist. Wax Artist is another one of those hunters that can sometimes struggle in the early game, but if he's able to get his max presence, he's able to deal quite some damage. Wax Artist is also very, very strong against some of the characters that are very prevalent here in competitive. I'm trying to think of particularly like Antiquarian. He does sometimes struggle a little bit against transitional kiters, but on the maps that he's good on, namely Moonlit, Lakeside, Chinatown, those are the main ones that come to mind. Wax Artist can have a somewhat solid early game, and if he's able to get to max presence, he's able to really snowball very quickly. So Wax Artist is a very, very solid pick if you need to fight for a tie in a tournament. Up next, I decided to put Anne. Anne is very, very popular and competitive now, very trendy. She has a fantastic early game with the cats. Can sometimes struggle. Once again, we're seeing a theme. Transitional kiters can be very, very strong. However, it requires a lot of precision, and if survivors make a mistake, Anne is able to very much snowball with that into a nice early game down. If she does end up getting a good down, she actually has, I would argue, maybe the second strongest camping in the game, second to Bonbon. Well, I guess Hellember has a very, very strong camp too, but you get the idea that Anne is actually very, very difficult to camp out unless you have a survivor such as Coordinator or Wildling on the team. It's going to be very, very difficult to actually get that rescue off, so she's able to fight for a tie, but can have some winning advantages in some situations. Now up next, this might be slightly controversial, but I would put Dream Witch at A tier. The reason why Dream Witch I don't believe is S tier anymore, but still very, very high A tier, is because survivors at the competitive level are very, very prepped against her. There are also some comps that are prevalent in the meta currently that are very, very tough on Dream Witch. But Dream Witch is, right now, I would argue, probably the second most common pick in competitive to fight for a win. She's one of those hunters, basically the main hunter where the term snowballing comes from. If she's able to get a very strong early game, she's able to snowball very well, has very, very good mobility and map pressure, being able to put multiple hunters on the ground at once. She's able to, if she gets an early game lead, she's able to snowball quite quickly. Her chase is pretty okay, not the best chase hunter in the game, but especially against inexperienced survivors, Dream Witch can have a very, very strong early game. There are also a lot of tricks involved with Dream Witch that you get to know the more you play her, that make her a solid competitive hunter. The main thing that makes her so good is her ability to monitor multiple ciphers at the same time, especially when it gets to one cipher remaining. The only main thing about Dream Witch is that sometimes the mid game can be very, very tough on her. If survivors are able to communicate properly, stay off the ciphers and regroup, it can actually be somewhat difficult to fight for a winning advantage, but still, Dream Witch is, I would say, probably the second most prevalent hunter to fight for a winning advantage in competitive. So up next we have Nightwatch. Nightwatch is a very, very solid competitive hunter. At the competitive level, he does require a lot of precision, but he's used very commonly, especially on Lakeside, but can also be used a lot on Chinatown. He does very well in open maps, can have a very, very good early game, and overall, just from a competitive hunter mentality, it is not quite as difficult to play as some of the other hunters on this list, which can make his game pretty consistent when he does his abilities correctly. So Nightwatch is a very, very solid pick for competitive. Up next we have Naiad. Naiad is one of the main hunters to fight for a win in competitive now. The one struggle that Naiad sometimes has is against comps that have flywheel, but she's very good at blocking off the really good kiting areas in each map. Some of her strongest maps, again, at the competitive level, Eversleeping, Chinatown. She's one of those hunters that's not quite as map dependent as some of the other characters though, so she's generally pretty strong anywhere, has a deceptively quite decent camp, and can exert a lot of pressure, being able to throw out the harpoon and block off ciphers. She is a very, very strong tournament pick to fight for a win. And next, I would say this hunter is probably the main hunter to use to fight for an advantage in a round 3 scenario, and this is going to be Smiley Face. Now, Smiley Face is used very commonly. The two main hunters I can think of are Shoai and RC Aka. They are both fantastic clown mains, And Clown is one of those hunters that if he's able to get the early game, once again, has very good chase and very good map pressure. He is also a very high skill cap character. There's so much you can do with Smiley to put a lot of pressure on the Survivor team. The only struggle is sometimes Smiley Face might struggle to find an early game chase in competitive if survivors are able to communicate properly and are not extremely gung-ho on decoding so quickly. Survivors do have to play a very slow game against a Smiley Face, which can lead a lot of times to a lot of mistakes coming out if survivors don't play properly, in which case Smiley does have a very good snowball potential. So that's why I put the A tier hunters where they're at, and now we go all the way up to S tier. Now, there are 3 hunters that I would argue are S tier currently. Now, the one I put at the top, or at the bottom of S tier, is Gamekeeper. Gamekeeper is one of the more recent hunters to be S tier, and the main reason why is it's more like what the survivors are picking. The survivor comps right now are prioritizing characters that can take a lot of hits and characters that are able to have very strong transitional kiting, of which Gamekeeper is probably the top counter to transitional kiters. He's able to be used generally any map. He's not a super map dependent hunter, and the main thing that makes him good is he has a pretty good early game. He has a hook that has sometimes quite questionable logic, leading to some hooks that are really able to swing things in the hunter's advantage. In addition to this, Gamekeeper also relatively recently got a buff that gives him unlimited hooks when he hits his max presence, which makes it so that he actually has very, very good mobility. So for these reasons, I am putting Gamekeeper at the bottom of S tier, maybe arguably like S- tier if you want to label it that way. But I would say that there is a big difference between Gamekeeper and the 2 hunters that I am putting at the top of my tier list. Now, at the top of the tier, or the second strongest hunter I'm putting on the tier list, is going to be the new hunter Ivy. Now, the Shadow is a hunter that will be coming to tournament very, very soon. Not quite in tourney just yet. However, I believe Ivy will be legal in this summer's IVT tournament for NAU, so I believe that Ivy will be used very commonly in the upcoming tournament. And I mean, the reasons are not so difficult to see. She's basically, I would argue, almost a better version of Dream Witch. She does have very, very strong map pressure, a very, very strong early game chase. The one way that Ivy sometimes struggles is in the middle game if survivors are able to kind of communicate and regroup. She can sometimes struggle a little bit in the mid game, but overall a very, very strong character. Also really, really strong against harassers, as the scares can interrupt almost any interaction or animation that the survivors are able to throw at her, which makes her a very, very consistent hunter to fight for a tie every single time, but also can fight for a lot of winning advantages out of stuff that for other hunters would be very tieable positions. And lastly, I'm putting Opera Singer at the top of the tier list for now. It'll be very interesting to see. I don't know quite yet whether to put a Singer or Ivy at the top. We'll have to see how she performs in competitive. But Opera Singer is a very, very strong round 1 hunter. Pretty much every team currently runs a Sangria during round 1. And the reason being is that she is a very, very fast hunter, and she's able to fight for a win out of many situations. So strong to the point that sometimes it's very difficult for survivors to even have any sort of tieable chances against her. Now, at the top level, sometimes survivors are able to fight for a tie with very, very specific comps and lots of precision, and a lot of times it takes some misplays by the hunter to really fight for that. However, Sangria is arguably still the strongest hunter in the game. Even with her upcoming nerfs, she will still be a very, very strong hunter. And yeah, so that is my overview of the S tier hunters. Let me know in the comments if you agree with my list. If you have some disagreements, I would be more than happy to have some debates in the comment section about this. But yeah, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And if you all want me to make a Survivor competitive tier list, or if you all want me to make a tier list for hunters that I would recommend for ranked, feel free once again to let me know in the comment section below. But yeah, thank you all for watching.